To understand all that is happening at the moment, it is good to know what has happened in the past. That is perhaps the challenging part, but also the very interesting one. When NATO was created in 1949, one of the main reasons for its creation was the increasing threat that the USSR posed to the Western Bloc. The Soviet Union was expanding enormously by the time, and the powers of the Eastern Bloc were soon to be linked together even more in the Warsaw Pact. NATO aimed both to protect its members and to counter the power of the USSR, as can be also seen in the NATO's motto. As said by the first Secretary-General Lord Ismay, NATO was created to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Even the quotation shows that one of the most important, and at that time, most strategic allies of NATO was the USA. Due to the ongoing Cold War, NATO was a very valuable partner to the United States. At that time the members of NATO were only Western European countries, as they were all in the same area, or the same bloc, as the US. Hence, for the time of the Cold War, the USSR was the main enemy of NATO. In 1991, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, NATO and Russia started to develop their first reluctant relations. Russian President Yeltsin even suggested, despite the general skepticism, that Russia might even one day become a member of NATO. Most of the members of his parliament protested, especially in 1993 when NATO wanted to enlarge and accept new members and by that expand its already enormous potential offensive powers. Russia eventually accepted the enlargement but conditioned it by demanding no deployment of nuclear weapons or allied combat forces on the territory of new member states. NATO agreed, in the end, even though the decision was marked as unsustainable by several experts. After this settlement in 1994, there was the first significant progress concerning the relationship as Russia joined NATO's Partnership for Peace program. Furthermore, in 1997, new cooperation was set with Russia over sustaining peace in the Euro-Atlantic area, and a new council at the Permanent Joint Council was set in order to regularly discuss the questions of security by signing the Founding Act. This act was very important for shaping the future way of cooperation and for forming the positions of both NATO and Russia. Russia knew that very well, so it has affirmed its respect for the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of all states and their inherent right to choose the means to ensure their own security. It also renounced spheres of influence here. Despite the efforts, negotiations were not going so smoothly as the long Cold War marked both sides with prejudice and large differences as well as a lack of understanding. NATO expert James Sher defined the relations as almost doomed to disappointment, as even though steps were made, both sides felt that the cooperation lacked harmony. According to Sher, NATO was always maybe too precautious towards Russia, hence Russia lacked equality, which for them means co-management. Nonetheless, Russia was a very valuable ally during solving the Kosovo conflict, when Russian and NATO soldiers fought together in order to restore peace, as well as in cooperating in Afghanistan. In 2002, the ties strengthened again with the permanent establishment of NATO-Russia Council, which allowed Russia to be taken as an equal partner to the 27 members. Another significant change concerned the meetings, which took place more often, twice a year for ministers and monthly with ambassadors. The number of joint topics also broadened, as well as expert groups and committees, which now expanded. On the other hand, Russia did not receive any security guarantee. Any variation similar to Article 5 was not mentioned. Another gap in the new advanced partnership was the war in Iraq. Russia, together with Germany and France, opposed, and successfully limited via UN resolution, the use of military force against Saddam Hussein. The relations nowadays continue to be very delicate and could be almost described as both better than ever and worse than ever. The current Secretary-General, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, said in his first major speech focused on Russia, September 2009, that of all of NATO's relationships with partner countries, none holds greater potential than the NATO-Russia relationship. And he was right. NATO and Russia nowadays share common interests. Among those momentous topics that are common to NATO and Russia are, for example, Afghanistan, arms control, counter-terrorism, counter-piracy, counter-narcotics, cybersecurity, Iran, control of potential North Korean missile defense program, resolution of frozen conflicts, economic cooperation, energy security, relief and prevention of natural and man-made disasters and organized crime. On the other hand, NATO and Russia still have many disputes and differences. Those are broadened by the scar of precaution and skepticism, lasting since the Cold War. These could be seen during many of the disagreements, such as the bygone conflict between Kosovo and Serbia, Georgia and of course Ukraine, which is the most current and most relevant right now. The dispute is so fatal that it caused NATO's suspension of all practical cooperation with Russia, which lasts till now. You could have also mentioned how the relationship between NATO and US was influenced by color revolutions and Arab Spring. One of the first significant collaborations between NATO and Russia was on the ground of Bosnia, around 1995. Although at first, it seemed that this conflict would break the ties, the opposite happened. While the alliance operated with airstrikes, Russia responded by sending troops who participated in the implementation force, which were the multinational peacekeeping forces implemented in Bosnia. By doing so, Russia proved to be a very valuable partner for the first time during the partnership. Not long afterwards, the disputes between the partners continued over the civil war in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. During the first meeting of the Permanent Joint Council, Russia warned NATO against the use of force without the authorization of the UN. Nonetheless, NATO took not as much attention as expected, and, having in mind Russia's weakened position, the North Atlantic Council authorized limited airstrikes and a phased air campaign in 1998. This act made Russia feel precautious and more skeptic voices were raised. Russia eventually suspended its ties with NATO, despite the fact that according to the founding act, Russia had to be consulted and had the right of veto, although that right was often guaranteed only theoretically, as shown during the council meetings where Russia was trying to counter the intervention in Yugoslavia but was not successful. Yeltsin proved to be right that a new diplomatic chess game was shaping and NATO started to dominate in many fields, but the position of Russia was not what he would hope for. NATO itself kept sending this message to Russia even after the Civil War. After Poland joined the NATO, the Allies wanted to move one of its headquarters from Germany to Poland, which was something they explicitly promised to Russia did not do, and eventually, they didn't. Despite all these disputes, Yeltsin knew that the partnership is very valuable for his weakened country. Russia's bad situation was even worsened by the war in Chechnya, so, eventually, they returned to NATO again and even started to cooperate. In 1999, Russia sent its troops to Kosovo to join the Kosovo forces. Moreover, in the year 2000, a new president was appointed in Russia, Vladimir Putin, who was seen as even more pro-NATO oriented than Yeltsin. September 11th was thought to be a possible turning point. President Bush and Putin met soon after the attacks and agreed that Russia will assist the USA in Afghanistan. Some of the key points of Russia's cooperation were allowing the US to operate in the Central Asian airspace, which Russia considered to be in its territory of influence, supporting the Afghan armed forces, the training of Afghan counter-narcotics forces, offering to close espionage centers in Cuba, Leod, and a naval base in Vietnam. Through this, Putin hoped to strengthen relations with the West, counter the threat of terrorism, and benefit Russia by categorizing the rebels in Chechnya as terrorists, which indeed soon happened and subsequently significantly helped Russia. Nonetheless, another dispute appeared again, this time over the Georgia conflict, also called the War of South Ossetia, in 2008. Despite the fact that the real war conflict lasted only about 5 days during August that year, the political consequences were more fatal and long-lasting. The conflict began with Ossetian separatists, who started bombing Georgian villages. Georgia launched a military offensive in response. The role that Russia played in this conflict was sending army and air troops to support Ossetia. All sides, Russia, Georgia and South Ossetia, was accused of war crimes by the Human Rights Watch. Russia was blamed for invading a sovereign state and threatening democracy. This reflected negatively on the relationship with NATO. In response, the alliance suspended cooperation with Russia. As that happened, both sides started to accuse each other of returning to the Cold War tactics and added several new aggravating policies. Whether or not Russia intervened before or after the bombardment is not clear, though the steps Russia had made toward a sovereign state were enough to invoke several reactions among the former USSR states, among them being also Ukrainian President Yushchenko stated that he wanted to increase the rent for the Russian naval base in Sevastopol in Crimea as a response. Not long afterwards, in 2010, Russia and NATO started to cooperate again, this time on the ballistic missile defense, a problem which has been labeled as the game changer for NATO-Russia relations, for it was considered to be either a bridge towards the past or towards the future. Every little cooperation is a small step toward good relations, but there is still the importance of the big breakthrough, otherwise the risk of sliding back is very real, said a Russian political analyst Dmitry Drenin in an interview in 2011 as a part of reviewing the last 20 years of cooperation. He also said that Russia has moved since the Cold War, but in order to have a fully functioning relationship with one another, NATO should move on as well. Add the recent articles that state that there is still a double way of assessing the West and the East to this argument. There are suggestions that the West has made some similar steps as Russia is now judged differently. Another article says that the steps Russia make in Ukraine is a perfect example of a modern 21st century war, and it is actually NATO that falls behind. Even though some analysts says the opposite and calls the war a hybrid one. So who is the one causing the conflict and falling behind? Even though the relations and negotiations between Russia and the Allies became more integrated, NATO members kept its skeptical approach in their minds. This skepticism was fed and broadened especially by affairs such as Georgia. The alliance has been pointing out especially Russia's politically questionable and hegemonic attitude towards its neighbors, particularly with Georgia, Baltic states, Ukraine and Eastern and Central Europe. Unfortunately, Russia's steps in Ukraine are unacceptable for NATO and for ongoing cooperation between them. According to NATO, Russia fails to respect international commitments, hence NATO currently suspended cooperation with Russia because of its undertaking in Ukraine. After reviewing some of the most important milestones, we can see that the relationship is reflected in every step NATO has made over the 65 years of its existence. Nowadays, many experts and analysts are debating the role of NATO in the 21st century. These debates escalated especially after NATO's soldiers started to leave Afghanistan. Some say NATO is now more conservative, precautious, and is finding its role as there is no direct threat posed to the members. Several claims that to stay relevant, NATO must provide security beyond just Europe. Whether or not it is true, we might see very soon the Ukraine crisis.